Okay, so today I'm going to be showing you how to make a muslin or a mock-up from your drape. So at this point you should have your pattern pieces traced out. You're going to need muslin. It's the best fabric for making mock-ups with. You're going to need your clear see-through ruler, your scissors for fabric, as well as your pencil. A nice sharp one will do. Now the first thing that you're going to do is basically start the exact same way that you did with your sample corsets that you've already done. You're taking every pattern piece that you have and you're tracing it out on fabric twice because we want to make a corset that goes from the center front all the way around to the center back. So you want to make sure that you cut out every single piece times 4. So 2 for each side, because we're going to construct it the exact same way that we did our samples. Starting with flat basting, moving on to adding our boning channels, and moving on to adding our boning and our seams. So the next thing that you want is to lay out these pattern pieces in line with your grain, trace them out, and the other thing that you're going to do is if you've already added seam allowance to the sides, you're going to use your see-through ruler and your pencil to trace those seam allowance lines and internal seam lines onto your pattern or onto your muslin so that you have an understanding of where your seam allowance is, how wide it is, and where to stitch when you're flat basting and adding your boning. So you're still tracing those internal lines like we did for the sample. You'll have the piece plus the seam allowance traced out on your fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing that, and then we're going to move on to cutting it out and flat basting it. Okay, so at this point I'm just showing you what I have traced out. So I've done exactly the same thing here that we've done for our sample corsets. I've gone ahead and I've put a number for the pattern piece up in the top seam allowance, all in the same corner so that I know exactly which way my pieces should be facing. I've included my notches and I've indicated where the seam allowance is on all of my pieces. So I'm still leaving 1 inch at the top and 1 inch at the bottom of each piece. And I'm just going to carefully move over to my cup and my hip pieces. So these pieces obviously look a little bit different than our corset pieces. They still get numbers though. So for my top band of my cup, I've labeled it number 8. Each of my bottom parts of my cup are labeled 6 and 7, and each of my hip pieces are 9 and 10. So I actually have 10 pieces going across from center front to center back on both halves of my corset. So this might take a little bit more fabric than what you had for your original corset, the samples that we made, because we're adding extra pieces. So our last corsets didn't have cups and they didn't have hip panels, so that's why we have a little bit extra to cut out here. Now the other thing too is because you have a cup with a band, the top of the band gets that 1 inch seam allowance, everything else gets 5/8 of an inch. And then your bottom hip panels, each one gets 5/8 seam allowance, except on the bottom it gets 1 inch. And that way we make sure that when we sew it to the rest of our corset, we get all the same seam allowance sewing together, top, bottom, and side to side. Alright, so at this point I've traced out all my pieces. For one side I've got to do the flip and trace out all the others, either below or next to these, and then I'm going to cut it all out, and then I'm going to come back and show you how we start piecing it together. Okay, so at this point you should have all of your pieces cut out. Now this is my entire corset from center front to center back. The other half is over here in a pile. But basically I have my center back panel, my side back panel, my side panel that's in between the front and the back, my side front panel, my center front panel, my 2 hip panels, and my 3 cup pieces with the band. Now the next thing you're going to do is pretty similar to what we did in the 19th century sample corset. You will be flat basting all the pieces except for your center front and your center back. Those we're going to deal with exactly the same way as we did when we did our 19th century samples. So if you remember correctly, we will be flipping the center back and doing a clean finish along the center back. And then on the center front, you'll be inserting your busk. Now for me, because I'm doing a no busk center front for this sample, I'm just going to go ahead and seam my center fronts together, and I'll show you how that looks when I piece it all together. If you are inserting a busk into your final design, it is a good idea to try it out in the mock-up before you make the final. What you want to do is make sure that your busk fits between the top and the bottom of your center front. It will not come into contact with your cup. You want to make sure that it's well within a space going up and down the center front. It might even start a little bit lower than the top of the center front, just to make sure that you're not getting too bulky where your cup is sewing in. So make sure that if you are inserting a busk for your mock-up or your final, you'll want to go ahead and treat the center front the same way we did when we inserted our busk for our 19th century corset samples. However, if you are not inserting one, then you can just go ahead and flat baste it exactly like all the rest of the pieces except for your center back. Now, a good idea for the center back is if you have the eyelet tape, you can go ahead and seam it to your center back. If you don't do that at this point, you can always add it later, and that's fine. But it does help to have something to lace it up when you're trying it on the Judy. Now, you can also choose to insert metal grommets or eyelets into this piece so that you can lace it up on the Judy, or you can just make holes with your awl and lace between them. Because it's a mock-up and it's just a sample, it doesn't have to be perfect. The eyelet tape helps, and that is in your kit, and you're more than welcome to use it for your sample or your mock-up or your personal corsets, but I'm going to go ahead and just leave my center back finished without the eyelet tape, and I'm going to just poke holes with my awl. So you're going to go ahead and flat baste the pieces exactly like we did when we started our 19th century samples. You're going to flat baste all the seams except for the tops. So these tops here. And the other thing as well, we're leaving those tops open because you want to be able to sew your bone channeling and insert your bones into your corset before you make your final corset. The fit will be different if you do not test your boning in it when you try it on. It will have a different fit with the boning. So you want to make sure that you leave space open at the top to insert all your bones. So that goes for these 5 panels across from center front to center back. Now for your cup, you're going to go ahead and flat baste the entire seam, and that's including the top. Now the reason for that is because there is no boning inserted in any of the cup pieces, generally speaking. You might choose to insert an underwire, which is a different method of construction. I don't, not in my mock-up, possibly in my final, but I generally do not insert an underwire into my cup. So I go ahead and I just flat baste all around all of my cup pieces. Now your hip pieces, they're a little different. So we do have the bottom 1-inch seams. We're going to flat baste across that. We're also going to flat baste up the curved seam that would be sewing into our panels around the top here. And we are going to flat baste along the seam that connects them. Now what's going to happen when we do our bone channeling is you're going to have to unpick a little bit of that flat basting right at these 2 top seams, because generally there is boning on each side of your hip panel seam in the middle, and there's also boning that goes above in your side panel as well, right in the center. So you want to make sure that that boning has a channel space as well, but go ahead and start by flat basting all around it. You're not going to serge any of your pieces in your mock-up because it doesn't make sense to. You don't need to, because it's not going to be a finished garment. It's just for fit. It's just to try out your pattern and make sure it walks and works, and so that you can try it on and make sure that if there is anything that needs to be fixed, you have the space and time to do so with this rough version of your corset. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to flat base all my pieces exactly as we would. I'm going to bring them back over and I'm going to show you what they look like, and then we're going to start adding our bone channeling so that we can go ahead and start adding boning to our mock-up. All right. All right, so this is half of my corset with the boning channels stitched in. Now I've left every opening that I need for my bones open to slide them in. What's going to happen and what's going to make things a little bit difficult are at the center seam of your hip, it's going to be seaming to this U shape. Now, for the most part, you can add the bones here and then sew the shape and it should be fine. However, if you're finding that it is difficult to make this U with boning in, what you might rather do is insert your bones from the bottom seams after these are all seamed together. Now that's obviously up to you. It's a completely different way of what we did before, but there is no real right or wrong when it comes to inserting your bones at this point. So if you wanted to, you could sew your tops shut and insert your bones from the bottom if that makes your life easier. The only place where it's not going to pan out for you is piece number 3 here, where it's part of the U for the cup. At some point, you will have to seam a curved shape with the boning already in the piece. Once I've connected my hip and my cup for my bust here, it closes off where the bones can go in and out of piece number 3. So there are going to be some difficult seams to sew coming ahead, but you just want to make sure that you have all your boning channels stitched and you can start seaming together your pieces in preparation to insert the bones after. So it is a little bit of a tricky process if you have both hips and cups separate pieces added, because you're going to seam the whole middle part first, then you're going to have to insert those bones where you're not going to be able to access the seams after you put the cup and the hips on. So you'll just have to be strategic as to how you put it together, and it will be different based on whatever your design is. For me, the first thing I'm going to do is seam together the center back to the center front vertical panels. I'm going to go ahead and insert my bones as needed into piece number 3, and then seam together my hip, sew the hip in, and insert my hip bones from the bottom. So then I'm going to move on to doing the cups last because they can sew in at the very end. And I'm not going to insert any of the boning that intersects with the cup except for piece number 3, which will be sandwiched in between the hip and the cup. I'll insert all of my bones for my center front and my second piece from the bottom after I've sewn in my cup here. So the cup is the next step after that, but first I'm going to start by seaming these together so that I don't lose track of them. And then I'm going to start sewing together my hip and my cup pieces, which I'll bring back out. Now, the other thing that you're going to want to do, considering that you have all these boning channels on your pieces, is transfer where you are putting these boning channels onto your pattern. Now, you can wait till the end to do the ones on the seam, because if we try this on the Judy and it doesn't fit and you need to make alterations, it's going to cut into your bone channels that are traced onto your seams on your pattern. So you just want to make sure that you are keeping track of where you've placed all your boning, either in a chart or on your pattern, so that when you go to make your final corset, you're putting the bones in all the same places that you did for your mock-up. So it's a little bit tedious. It's kind of a stop and go process, but you want to make sure that you're keeping organized the entire way through so that you don't lose track of where you are and how these pieces fit together. So I'm going to go ahead and start seaming all of these together, and then I'm going to come back to put together my cup and show you how I do that. All right. So I've gone ahead, I've seamed my center front pieces all the way across to my center back, and I've gone ahead and sewn the middle seam in my hip panel here. I've also attached it in its horseshoe shape that attaches at the bottom of panel 3. Now, what you can see here is that it is sewn in quite well to this U, but I've noticed that my panels don't line up. So if you see here, my boning channels are off. I'll want to fix that before I go into my final. So you can go ahead and make pencil marks there that will remind you that that is what you need to change going into your final. You can also make those adjustments in your pattern. Now the other thing too that I notice is that my bottom seam doesn't line up. So sometimes these things happen. Curves especially, including this giant one here, don't always walk the same way that they're going to sew. So sometimes we do make a few errors in our seam allowance. We make errors when we are transferring our drape to a draft, to an actual muslin. So you'd go ahead and make sure that you make the necessary changes in your pattern so that these panels do line up and we don't have these gaps at the bottom. What it appears I did with mine is I might have added too much seam allowance to the bottom. I don't know if that's an error that I made from the drape to the draft to the muslin, or when I was transferring my seam allowance. All these things can happen. It's kind of detective work and going backwards, making sure that your patterns all match. So you'll definitely go back, fix little issues like this. Now I went ahead and seamed this U because I'm going to go ahead and insert my boning for the center of my hip panel from the bottom up, but I'm going to insert my boning for the panels down in piece number 3 over here, where they're sandwiched between the seam of the hip panel and where the cup is going to be. I'll go ahead and put those bones in from the top. Now these other bones in pieces 2 and 1 that have space at the bottom here, I don't have to insert those bones yet. I can go ahead and construct my cup and attach it here after I've inserted those bones in my sandwich piece number 3. And then I can go ahead and insert the bones for these panels from the bottom up. I'll just unpick my basting. So there are ways to get around sewing those obnoxious curves without already having bones in here. It's just a matter of working either from the bottom or the top. So at this point, we're going to pull forward our cup pieces. So here's the cup area that I'm going to sew these pieces into. But first I have to actually construct the cup. So I'm going to go ahead with all my notches lined up. I'm going to seam together the bottom part of my cup and across the band here, and then I'm going to bring it back and I'm going to attach it to this U. So I'm going to go ahead and sew with that seam allowance. I'm going to bring it back and show you how I trim it and then attach it into here. Alright, so I've gone ahead and I've seamed my cup. Now from the outside it looks pretty good. There's maybe one little point here that looks like it's giving me a bit of a wrinkle, and nothing in the undersection. Now, because everybody's cups are going to be different depending on the size of the cup you're making, it might not lay flat without doing some internal clipping through the seam, and that's completely normal. You can just go ahead and clip into that seam as necessary up to the point where you stitched. Now, you want to be careful not to clip too far, just enough to give you a little bit of flexibility in that seam so that it's not doing any kind of pucker. What you might also find helpful in terms of clipping is that you might want to trim your seam allowance down. Sometimes 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch is just too much to be inside a cup. That being said, some simple trimming should help. Taking it down to a 1/4 inch seam can sometimes do it, or you might have to literally clip up to your seam line in your cup. Now there are different ways to construct a cup. I'm doing mine this way. It's accurate to theater construction in that we can easily access these seams and alter them. You are also more than welcome to clean finish this by facing the 2 seam allowances together, seaming it closed across the top, inserting either a cup-shaped piece of neoprene or a actual cup that fits your cup size. You can insert those at this time as well. I'm going to go ahead and make mine just like that, and I'm going to attach it right to my corset. Now, it's going to sew into the U the exact same way that our hip panel did, but I'm not ready to attach this to this piece until all my boning is inside these pieces that are sandwiched. So on pieces 2 and 3 here, I've got a seam that starts from the cup and ends at the hip. So I have to make sure that the boning is already in those seams, because once I attach this cup, there's no way of getting back in there. So I need to make sure that I put those bones in first. The rest I can insert up from the bottom or down from the top on the other pieces. But for the cup where I'm sandwiching my hip panel down here and my cup up here, there's a seam that I just can't access after I close it. So that's the one seam that I'll put boning in, and then I'll sew my cup. Now if you had notches for this, for example mine only had a single notch really, and it was just this seam here that matches with my seam between pieces 1 and 2 here. So I want to be careful to match those and to honor my seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch, carefully moving around this U, easing it as I go. It's very easy to get puckers in these very deep U shapes. It's good to stretch them out as you go, to go ahead and ease things in. Lots of pins are very helpful. You can even hand baste it if that makes it easier, but ideally you want to make sure that you have no puckers. And then when that sews in there, you should have a cup that looks a little bit like that. And then you're ready to go ahead and insert your bones. Do a basting stitch across any open seams where your bones could slide out. Make sure that you rebaste the bottom if you're inserting from the bottom and you're taking any basting stitches out to do that. And then finish the other side of your corset, and you're ready to actually try it on the Judy at that point. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to insert my bones, I'm going to sew this cup on, I'm going to insert the rest of my bones, and then we're going to try it on the Judy. Okie dokie. So I've gone ahead and inserted that cup into that seam. So as you can see again, I've made a little bit of an error in my draping and pattern transfer, and I've definitely miscalculated how much space that I needed up here for my cup, because now the top edge of my corset and my cup do not align. So that's again something that I'll fix in my pattern going forward for my final. And if you can look inside here, you'll notice that I've narrowly avoided any puckers sewing here because it is such a severe curve. So you might want to go ahead and do some trimming and clipping into the seam here in order to have it lay better on your body. So everything is appearing to look good. All I have to do now before I move on to fitting it on the Judy is slide all my bones either from the top or the bottom into this corset, make some holes for my eyelets down the side, finish the second half of this, seam it together at the center front, and then I can go ahead and test it on the Judy for fit. So again, you want to make sure that you've got all of your bones in before you fit it on the Judy, because you need to know how it fits with the bones in. And you can use any kind of boning for that. If you're not ready to purchase your steel boning, if you're planning to use that, you can go ahead and use the same old nylon boning that we've been using this whole time. It's a lot cheaper. If you're planning to use flat bones, remember that they have to be on seams that are straight. If it's a curved seam, a flat bone just won't travel around it. So you're better with a spring steel or a nylon boning. You can also use sew-on boning for this project as well if that's something that you're interested in using. You can definitely use that, like Ridgeline. If you also want to purchase a higher-end plastic boning, then you can go through Farthingales, and they carry German plastic boning as well. So you can go ahead and put your boning in, finish basting the top and bottom wherever you've left it open for those boning pieces, and you can go ahead, finish the other half of your corset, make some holes for your lacing here. How you do that is completely up to you. You can attach lacing tape, you can punch holes with your awl, you can put in grommets, however it works for you to make sure that it fits properly. Just make sure that when you are adding those holes down your center back before you fit it on the Judy and lace it up, that you are adding as many holes as you would in your final corset. Otherwise, it's not going to lace the same way and it might not get the same fit. So make sure that if you're placing holes every inch down the center back in your muslin or your mock-up, that you go ahead and make sure that in your final you are also placing them an inch apart to get the same fit. So at that point, you are ready to move on and fit your corset.